A small town in northern Maine greeted me with a silence I had never experienced before. I parked my car near an old cafe on the main street to take a break after a long drive. The place seemed frozen in time, houses with peeling paint, signs that hadn't been replaced in decades, and a few locals sitting on benches near the shops, observing the stranger, me. My name was Jason Myers. I was 30 years old, a photographer who had recently embarked on an ambitious project, a series of photographs of abandoned buildings in New England for a book my publisher planned to release. I had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something magnetic about them, as if they held thousands of untold stories, waiting for the right angle to capture them. This town wasn't chosen by chance. It was surrounded by dense forests, and a few miles away was a house I had read about in local archives. It seemed like the perfect candidate for my series. A tall, two-story wooden house in the middle of the woods, with no roads leading to it. After paying for my coffee and receiving a strange look from the barista, I headed to the rented cottage on the edge of town. It was modest but cozy, and most importantly, it had stable internet, essential for processing photos. The next day, I set out to find the house I had already studied through old photographs. There weren't many, but they gave me an idea of its structure: a high gable, narrow windows, a perfectly symmetrical facade. The house stood deep in the woods, but I found my way using an old map. The road was rough. Gravel turned into damp dirt that wound through the dense forest. Leaves formed a green canopy overhead, hiding the sun. I stopped the car and walked the rest of the way. When I saw the house for the first time, I was overcome by a strange feeling, as if someone was watching me. The old house was even more impressive than in the photos. Peeling paint, window panes covered in cobwebs, and a slightly ajar door that seemed to invite me inside. I took out my camera and started photographing the facade. Every angle, every detail seemed perfect for a shot. After an hour, I decided it was time to go in. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a wave of stale air engulfed me. It felt as though I was intruding on someone's peace. Inside, the house seemed almost untouched. The living room still had old furniture that looked as if it had been left only yesterday. I noticed a bookshelf with old tomes, some with yellowed pages. On the mantelpiece lay a black and white family photograph: a man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces seemed oddly elusive, as if time had blurred the image slightly. In the kitchen, I found a teacup sitting on the table. It looked almost new, but that was impossible. The house had clearly been abandoned for years. My camera clicked incessantly. This place was perfect. In a children's room, I found several toys that looked strangely clean and intact. They stood on a shelf like museum exhibits. A porcelain-faced doll stared at me with hollow eyes. That evening, back at the cottage, I reviewed the photos. One of them sent a chill down my spine. In a shot of the living room, taken minutes after I had entered, there was a blurry silhouette visible in the window. It could have been a trick of the light, but I was certain the house had been empty. It was nearly midnight when I set the camera aside. The room grew very quiet. Too quiet. And suddenly, I heard something creak in the living room. My heart raced. I got up, turned on the light, and went to check. But there was nothing. Just me and my belongings. It was probably just the wood settling with age. But from that moment, I couldn't shake off the unease. The next day, I decided to return to the house. In the morning, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something had changed. When I woke up, everything seemed normal, but there was an unsettling sensation, as if someone, or something, had stood nearby during the night, watching me. All morning, the thought of that silhouette in the photograph haunted me. I set out for the house again. This time, the road felt longer, as if the forest were closing in around me. The tree branches hung low overhead, and every sound of my footsteps unnerved me more than I cared to admit. The house stood where I had left it. But something was different. The door, which I had left ajar, was now closed. Perhaps the wind? Or maybe I just hadn't noticed? I pulled out my camera and began photographing the facade again. This time, I felt as though someone was watching me. Inside, It was as silent as before, but I almost immediately noticed that things had shifted. The teacup was no longer on the table. It was now on the floor, as if someone had knocked it over. In the children's room, the doll that had been on the shelf was now sitting on a chair, facing the door. This could no longer be a coincidence. I photographed all of it, trying to stay calm. I realized the photos could serve as evidence if anything went wrong. But it was difficult. My sense of unease grew stronger with every passing minute. The air was damp, and the silence was so thick I could hear my pulse in my ears. As I was leaving the children's room, I heard a sound. It was like a faint rustling upstairs. My heart raced. Who else could be here? For the first time, I considered the possibility that a homeless person might be living in the house, hiding in the upper rooms. That would explain the shifted objects. I climbed the creaky stairs, each step protesting under my weight. The second floor felt even gloomier. Everything was covered in dust, but in the middle of the hallway, I noticed clear footprints. They led to one of the rooms. I approached the door quietly and cautiously pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom. My heart stopped for a moment. On the bed lay a doll. It was the same one I had seen in the children's room. But how could it have gotten here? I didn't remember moving it. On the wall, I noticed a mirror. In its dusty surface, my reflection looked strange, slightly distorted. It was like a frame from an old film. I quickly took a photo and left. Back at the cottage, I immediately began reviewing the photos. Most of them looked normal, but the photograph of the mirror made me freeze. In it I saw my reflection, but behind me stood another figure. A tall, dark shape with long arms and a featureless face. I thought it might be some kind of lighting defect. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. Something I hadn't seen then but had felt. I decided to find out more about the house. At the town library, I was greeted by an elderly librarian who seemed like a living extension of the archives. When I asked about the house, she only shook her head. "Best to leave it alone," she said, not even looking up. I tried asking more, but she refused to speak. Instead, I started digging through old newspapers. After hours of searching, I found what I was looking for. The article was dated 1973. It described the disappearance of a family who had lived in the house, a man, a woman, and their 2 children. The police had found no signs of violence or escape. They had simply vanished. It was shocking. But what unnerved me even more was the mention in the article of the last person to see them alive. A neighbor had reported seeing strange lights in the house's windows the day before the family disappeared. He had also heard voices. I returned to the cottage late in the evening. It had begun raining again. When I entered the room, I was overwhelmed by the feeling that I wasn't alone. The lamp I had left on the table was now overturned. In the bathroom mirror, someone had written something with a finger. From the steam left over from my morning shower, a message appeared. "Stop." I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept circling back to the mirror and the words scrawled across it. "Stop." Someone had clearly been in my cottage while I was away. But who? And why? The locals seemed reclusive and had no apparent reason to scare me. Or perhaps they did? Still, I couldn't afford to succumb to fear. The next day, I packed my gear again and headed for the house. Despite the librarian's warning and the strange events, my curiosity got the better of me. I needed to unravel this mystery. The road to the house felt even more ominous than usual. Fallen leaves crunched beneath my feet, and an eerie silence enveloped the forest. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the door. It was ajar again, though I distinctly remembered closing it last time. I stepped inside, greeted by the same musty smell. But this time, there was another odor in the air, sweet and sharp, like something organic decaying. I began taking photos, starting with the usual angles: the living room, the staircase, the children's room. But within minutes, I realized something was wrong. Things had changed. A painting that had hung on the living room wall was now lying on the floor. On the kitchen table, there was a plate with remnants of food. This was impossible. No one could be living here. In the children's room, I was met with a sight that made me freeze in place. The doll I had seen before had moved again. Now it was sitting on the floor, its porcelain face turned toward me. Its eyes seemed to follow my every move. I snapped a few photos and returned to the hallway. That's when I heard it. At first, it was a faint rustling sound. Then, a quiet but distinct laugh. A child's laugh. It was coming from the staircase leading to the second floor. My heart raced, but I forced myself to follow the sound. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew heavier with every step. When I reached the second floor, the laughter stopped, leaving behind a suffocating silence. At the end of the hallway, the door to the bedroom was slightly open. I wasn't sure, but it looked as though light was moving inside, as if someone were walking with a flashlight. I approached and pushed the door open. The room was empty, but on the bed lay an old photo album. I opened it and saw a series of black and white photos, a man, a woman, and 2 children. The family that had lived here. On the last page, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a photograph of me. I was standing outside the house, camera in hand. I dropped the album and bolted from the room. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, the door behind me slammed shut with a loud creak. Strange sounds began echoing through the house. Something was dragging itself down the stairs, shuffling and thudding as if someone were pulling a heavy suitcase. I hurried downstairs, only to find that the front door was now closed. I rushed to it and tried to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard movement in the kitchen. Turning around, I saw a teacup slowly sliding across the table, as if pushed by invisible hands. It teetered on the edge for a moment before crashing to the floor and shattering. Panic overtook me. I ran through the house, searching for a way out, but every door I tried was locked. Finally, I returned to the living room, where a new sight awaited me. On the floor, among the shards of the teacup, was a message. This time, it was spelled out with the broken pieces. Stay. When I finally escaped the house, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The forest around me felt even darker, and the path back to my car seemed endless. By the time I reached the cottage, my hands were shaking, and a fire of fear burned inside me. I resolved never to return to that place. But that night, everything changed. A voice echoed in my head, soft and barely audible. It whispered, "You belong to us." All night, I couldn't sleep. The voice in my head was soft but relentless, as if someone were whispering directly into my ear. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the house. Silhouettes of its inhabitants, those who had vanished years ago, seemed to stand in the shadows, waiting for me. At dawn, I got up and tried to distract myself with work. My equipment was still in the car, so I had to go out to fetch it. When I opened the trunk, I noticed something strange. Among my belongings lay an old cassette in a plastic case. I was certain I hadn't brought it with me. On the cassette's label was a single word: "Listen." I took the cassette and brought it into the cottage. In the corner of the room was an old tape player, likely left by the previous tenants. It looked functional, so I decided to play the tape. When I pressed play, the player hummed, and sounds began to emerge from the speakers. At first, it was just white noise, but after a few seconds I heard a voice. It was deep, male, and calm. "We are here, do you hear us? We're waiting." I grabbed the player and hit pause. My hands were trembling, and my heart pounded in my chest. Who had recorded this? And how did the tape end up in my car? I suspected it might be a prank, but there was something about that voice. It felt as though it was speaking directly to me. I couldn't leave it at that. After a few minutes of hesitation, I pressed play again. This time, other voices joined the man's, a woman and 2 children. They spoke over one another, as if in a conversation, but their words were unclear. I caught only fragments. "No, don't go there. He knows we're here. The game is over." The recording ended abruptly, leaving me with a growing sense of unease. I couldn't understand what it meant, but one thing was clear. I was now a part of something I couldn't control. Despite my fear, I decided to return to the house. Perhaps the answers lay there. On the drive, I tried not to think about the cassette or what I'd heard, but the voices continued to echo in my mind. They had become part of me. By the time I reached the house, it was past noon. Sunlight filtered through the dense trees, but it felt dim and cold. The house's door was closed, but I knew something awaited me inside. I entered, and this time, I didn't feel fear, just a strange sense of inevitability. In the living room, on the mantelpiece, I noticed an old tape player, identical to the one in my cottage. It looked newer than the other objects in the house, as if someone had brought it here recently. I pressed play, and the same voice emerged clearer this time. "Jason, you're with us. You're ours." I jumped back from the tape player. How could they know my name? Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. The voice continued. "We see you. We're waiting for you." I bolted toward the exit, but the door was locked again. I pounded on it, but the lock wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard soft laughter, children's laughter. I turned sharply. In the hallway, on the staircase, stood two figures. The children. The same ones I'd seen in the photographs from the album. They held hands and stared silently at me. I couldn't move. The children stood like shadows, unmoving. But their eyes, they were black, empty, as though the night itself was staring at me through them. Then they vanished, dissolving into thin air. At that moment, the door suddenly creaked open. I ran out of the house without looking back and rushed to my car. Back at the cottage, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The voices, the children's shadows, it wasn't just hallucinations. I felt as though the house itself was alive, pulling me deeper into its world. I played the cassette again, hoping to hear something new, but this time, it wouldn't play. The tape player emitted only a dull hum, as if it had broken. In the corner of the room, the red indicator on my camera was blinking. I opened the photo viewer and found an image I was certain I hadn't taken. It was a picture of me. I was standing in front of the house, but I looked different. My clothes were outdated, and my face seemed altered, as if it were someone else who only resembled me. Beneath the photo was a caption. "You belong to us." I couldn't tear my eyes away from the photograph. My hand trembled as I stared at it. There was something off about the image, something unreal, but at the same time, there was no doubt, it was me. The camera displayed a date that seemed impossible, July 15, 1973. The same year the family in the house had disappeared. I threw the camera onto the table and stepped back. My mind raced with only two thoughts. I had to leave immediately. But at the same time, something about this place held me. In the morning, I packed my things, deciding not to waste any more time. The cottage was rented for a few more days, but I decided to leave the money behind and just go. I got into my car and drove down the only road leading out of the forest. After 15 minutes of driving, I suddenly realized that the scenery around me wasn't changing. The forest looked the same, and there were no crossroads. I began to grow nervous but kept moving. Another 10 minutes later, I saw something that made me slow down. Ahead of me stood a building. My mind refused to accept it. It was the same house. I hit the brakes and stepped out of the car. I looked around. The road seemed identical to the one I had been driving on, but now it had led me back to the house. I walked a few dozen steps, trying to find a fork or turn, but there was nothing, only my own footprints in the damp soil. Returning to the car, I felt like I was suffocating. This was a nightmare. Logic told me I had to keep driving, but my intuition said something in this forest was holding me back. Determined not to give up, I got back into the car and drove on. 20 minutes later, I was back in front of the house. I stepped out of the car and shouted into the empty forest. "What do you want from me?" There was no response. Only a gentle breeze that seemed to underscore the hopelessness of the situation. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures of everything around me. Maybe later, I'd find some clues in the images. Suddenly, I heard something. Footsteps in the forest, slow but approaching. I turned, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I yelled. The footsteps stopped, leaving an eerie silence. I began backing toward the car when I saw something on the ground. It was a child's toy, a worn plush teddy bear. It looked as though it had just been placed there. I picked up the toy, and for a moment, an image flashed in my mind. The room in the house, the children's room, and two children holding this very bear. Their faces were blank, as if a fog had obscured their features. I dropped the bear and ran to the car. Starting the engine, I floored the accelerator and decided to drive without stopping. I tried not to look to either side, but after a few minutes, something made me slam on the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure. Motionless, cloaked in the shadows of the trees. My heart leapt as I recognized it, the man from the photograph in the house. His head was tilted as if he were staring straight at me. I pressed the gas pedal, but as the car passed through the figure, it simply vanished. No sound, no resistance, like smoke blown away by the wind. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, it was already late. I was in the middle of the forest, unsure of where to go next. My phone had no signal, and the camera's battery was almost dead. Then I heard voices. They sounded distant, as if coming from the house, yet somehow they were right next to me. The voices were familiar, the same family I had seen in the photographs. "We're here. You're ours. Don't run." I collapsed to the ground, covering my ears, but the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, blending with the sound of children laughing and crying. Fear consumed me, but I couldn't move. When I finally gathered enough strength to lift my head, I saw the house again. This time, it felt closer. Light flickered in one of the windows, as if beckoning me to enter. I knew it was a trap, but I had no other choice. I walked toward the house, hoping to find answers. This time, I was ready to fight. But could you fight something that defied explanation? The door swung open on its own as I approached. Inside, something dark awaited me, something that felt alive. The darkness inside the house no longer scared me. It enveloped me, silently calling me deeper, and I felt there was no point in resisting. As I stepped over the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, cutting off any chance of retreat. The air was thick and cold, and every breath felt labored. The flashlight on my phone barely lit the space ahead. Turning on my camera, I began taking photos again. The click of the shutter was the only sound, apart from my heavy breathing. I made my way to the living room, where the tape recorder I had seen before was once again sitting on the mantelpiece. But this time, there was a note next to it. On a yellowed scrap of paper, the words read, "Do you want to know the truth? Go downstairs." I looked around, searching for any sign of life, but the house remained silent and empty. Then, suddenly, I heard a knock. It came from below. My heart tightened, but my feet carried me toward the stairs leading to the basement. The staircase was narrow, each step creaking loudly in the oppressive silence, as if the house itself were listening. When I reached the bottom, the stench of dampness and decay hit me like a wall. The room was pitch dark, save for a faint light in one corner. An old lantern illuminated a table covered with various objects, aged papers, photographs, cassette tapes, and what looked like an antique camera. I approached and touched the camera. It was icy cold, as if it had just been pulled from a freezer. There was a roll of film inside. I knew I had to develop it, but dread gripped me at the thought of what I might see. On the table, I also found a notebook. Opening it, I saw chaotic entries written in different handwriting styles. The notes were fragmented, but each page grew more unsettling. "We hear them. They're calling us. This house is a trap. The photograph is the key." The final entry was written in neat, deliberate handwriting, as though someone had penned it without hurry. "Whoever photographs stays here forever." Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. Turning quickly, I saw a silhouette. It was the woman from the family photographs. Her face was distorted, as though several different images had been superimposed onto her features. She stared at me, silently. I stepped back, my hand knocking over the lantern. Darkness engulfed the basement. The whispers began, soft at first, but soon filling the room, mixing with the laughter of children and muffled sobs. In the darkness, I felt my way toward the stairs, but they were gone. Instead, I found another door. I didn't remember seeing it before. The door was old and heavy, with rusted hinges. It opened on its own, revealing a room that resembled a photo lab. On the walls hung photographs of people taken across various years. All of them stared directly into the camera, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They weren't just posing, they seemed to know their time was up. One of the photographs caught my eye. It was of me. The picture had been taken here, in this house. In the image, I stood in front of the entrance, with the family behind me. Their faces were blurred, but I knew it was them. In the corner of the room was a box filled with more photographs. I sifted through them and saw dozens of other people, all of whom had likely come to this house before me. The dates varied, but every one of them had vanished within days of their photo being taken here. Among the photographs, I found something that made my teeth clench. It was my wallet. But how had it ended up here? All my documents were intact. On the back of my driver's license, someone had written in red ink, "You already belong to them." I bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. When I reached the living room, the front door was wide open. I ran out of the house, nearly tripping over myself, and raced to my car. Once inside, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A figure was staring at me. I turned around, but the back seat was empty. Yet the mirror didn't lie. There was a silhouette sitting behind me. I slammed on the gas and sped off the property. The road stretched into darkness, but I no longer cared about direction. I just needed to get away. I drove down the forest road, no longer caring where it led. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers turned white. There was no one in the rearview mirror anymore, but the feeling that someone, or something, was sitting behind me refused to go away. When I finally reached a crossroads, it felt like I had escaped. But the road that should have led to the town instead brought me back to the house. For the third time. The yard looked exactly the same as before. The house stood there as if nothing had happened, its door slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for me. But now I knew it was a trap. I wasn't going inside. I grabbed my camera and began taking pictures. It felt like the only thing I could do to find some sort of clue. The facade, the windows, the yard, I captured everything. In one of the photos, I saw something. In the window on the second floor, a figure stood. It was a woman. She was simply watching me. I threw the camera onto the car seat and slammed the gas pedal. The tires spun before finally catching, and I sped off. This time, I wasn't stopping until I was out of here. The forest seemed endless. I no longer recognized the road. It felt as though I was driving in circles, but my GPS showed only a blank screen. My phone had no signal. Suddenly, the car began to sputter, and the engine died. Panic set in. I tried restarting the car, but the battery was dead. My only option now was to walk. I grabbed my camera, flashlight, and started down the road on foot. The forest was dark, and every sound seemed suspicious. Twigs snapped in the bushes, and somewhere far away, I heard an owl. But the silence was the most terrifying part. It was unnatural, oppressive. When I saw the house again, everything inside me collapsed. I no longer understood what was real. There it stood, just as before. This time, its windows glowed with warm, inviting light, as if beckoning me to come in. I stepped closer. Through the window, I could see a dining table in the living room, set with a fresh meal, bread, meat, vegetables. Everything looked so real, but I knew it was an illusion. I began taking pictures again. In every window, figures started to appear. It was the same family from the photographs, the man, the woman, and the 2 children. They stood silently, staring at me. As I took a few steps back, something grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. Then I heard a voice. "They're waiting. Come in." The voice echoed in my head, yet it also seemed to emanate from the house. My legs refused to obey, and I stepped forward, then another step. I couldn't stop myself, as though some force was pulling me. The door opened on its own, and I walked inside. Everything looked different now. This wasn't the decrepit, abandoned house. It was a cozy, vibrant home, full of life. Family photographs adorned the walls, and the scent of fresh food filled the air. Laughter came from the kitchen. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall. A woman stepped out of the kitchen. It was the same woman from the photographs. Her face was no longer distorted. She smiled and said, "You've come home." I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. The man, the woman, and the 2 children now stood before me. They looked happy, but their eyes held no life. They were empty. "We've been waiting for you," the man said. "Now you're one of us." Suddenly, the room began to change. The walls cracked, and the photographs fell to the floor. The children's laughter turned into wailing, and their faces began to warp, as if someone were erasing them with an invisible hand. I bolted toward the stairs, but they seemed endless. The house wouldn't let me go. I descended into the basement. It was the only path left. Down there, I found only a dark corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. At the end of the hallway, I saw a door. When I opened it, I saw myself. I stood outside the house, holding a camera. But it wasn't me now. It was me who had already become part of this place. I stared into the lens, and behind me stood the family. On the wall beside me, written in blood, were the words, "You are one of us now." I stood in the darkness of the basement, staring at my double through the doorway. The camera in that other version of me looked identical to mine, pointed directly at me, as if it was capturing this moment for eternity. The family behind him gazed with empty eyes, their silhouettes blending with the shadows of the house. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, leaving me in complete darkness. My flashlight was nearly dead, flickering weakly. Each step in the basement felt like an eternity. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on me as if the house itself was suffocating me. Finally, my hand found an old table where the camera I'd seen earlier lay. I picked it up. The camera was heavy, metal, and cold as ice. The film inside was wound, ready to be developed. On its body, I noticed engraved initials, JM. My heart sank. Those were my initials. How could this be? Did the camera belong to someone else who had been trapped here before? Or had I always been part of this place without realizing it? I found a room that looked like a darkroom for developing photos. There was an old tray for processing film and stacks of photographs, many of which I had already seen. They were all of people staring directly into the camera. Some were dated from the 1950s or 60s, while others looked recent. All of them had been taken in this house. I developed the film from the camera. As the images emerged on the paper, my blood ran cold. The first photos showed me. I was in the children's room, holding the porcelain doll. Then, in the kitchen, bent over the teacup. But the last photo was different. It wasn't taken in the house. It was of me sitting in my car, just moments before the engine had died on the road. Someone had taken the picture, but I hadn't noticed them. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold. I heard the sound of children laughing, and in the doorway appeared a figure. It was one of the girls from the family photographs. She stood clutching her teddy bear, silently watching me. "It's the camera," she whispered, her voice carried as if on the wind. "It keeps us here." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "It shows the truth," she said. "But no one can leave once they've seen it." She stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I was left alone in the room, surrounded by photographs that now felt like a sentence. I grabbed the camera and resolved to find a way out. In the basement, I spotted another door I hadn't seen before. It was heavy, wooden, and led to a tunnel that disappeared into the darkness. Following the tunnel, I emerged in another part of the house that looked completely different. The living room was filled with people. They all looked like the subjects of the photographs, frozen expressions, empty eyes. They didn't move, but they all stared directly at me. "This place keeps us," said a man standing at the center. He was the same man from the family photographs. "You found the camera. Now you're part of it." "I don't want to stay here," I shouted. "This isn't my story." He smiled. "It became yours the moment you took your first picture." I bolted back to the basement, grabbing the film, photographs, and camera. I knew the only way to end this was to destroy everything. I gathered all the photos, the film, and the camera, tossing them into the metal developing tray before setting them alight. Flames erupted, and I heard screams emanating from every corner of the house. It felt alive, and now it was in pain. Smoke filled the room, choking me as I struggled to find my way out. In the chaos, I stumbled outside into the quiet night. The house no longer glowed, and its windows looked lifeless. I climbed into my car. This time, the road ahead was straight. But as I glanced into the rearview mirror, my stomach sank. There I was, standing in front of the house, holding the camera, with the same family behind me once again. The road stretched endlessly ahead, straight and unchanging. The forest around me seemed dense, the air growing heavier with each mile. I didn't stop or look back, trying to convince myself it was finally over. But in the rearview mirror, I still saw that image, me standing in front of the house, with the family's empty faces behind me. That frame haunted me, filling every corner of my mind. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, the sun was setting. A road sign indicated a small town just a few miles away. I felt a glimmer of relief, believing I might finally be free. Yet deep inside, a gnawing sense of unease remained. The house hadn't let me go. I pulled into a rundown motel at the edge of the town. It was an old, shabby place, but to me, it felt like a sanctuary. After signing in, I entered my small room with cracked walls and a musty smell. The warm shower and the quiet helped ease my nerves, if only a little. I took out my camera, deciding to review the photographs again. Maybe now, far from that cursed house, I could piece together what had happened. But what I saw froze me in place. Every photo I had taken now showed something new. The last shot of the house no longer displayed just the facade, it showed a window, and in that window, I was standing inside, looking out, as if I had become part of the house itself. My phone suddenly vibrated. The signal had returned. Without hesitation, I called my friend Dan, someone rational and level-headed. He answered with a mix of relief and confusion. "Jason, where the hell have you been? We've been looking for you for 2 days." 2 days? I repeated. "But I left the house just a few hours ago. You disappeared. We found your car by the forest, but you were gone. What happened?" I tried to explain, but every word sounded absurd even to me. I told him about the house, the photographs, and how it trapped people. He listened, but I could sense his skepticism, his inability to reconcile my story with reality. "Listen," he said after a pause. "We'll come get you tomorrow. You're probably just exhausted." That night I barely slept. Every shadow in the room seemed alive, and the whispers in my head grew louder. "You can't escape. You're ours." When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the house. I was back in the basement, surrounded by photographs. The walls closed in around me, as if trying to swallow me whole. I awoke to a knock at the door. Glancing at the clock, I saw it was just 3 a.m. Who could it be? Summoning the last shreds of my courage, I approached the door and opened it. On the threshold stood a little girl holding a plush teddy bear. She looked exactly as she had in the photographs. Her eyes were black, and she said nothing at first. "You can't run," she finally whispered, her voice sharp and piercing. "It's already inside you." I slammed the door and stumbled back, shaking with fear. The room filled with the smell of smoke. Turning around, I saw the camera sitting on the table, glowing faintly red, even though I was certain I had left it in the car. I picked it up, and without thinking, pressed the shutter. The click was deafening, like an explosion, and the room filled with black and white images, projected like a film. I saw every person who had ever been in that house. They all stared at me, reaching out as if trying to warn me of something. Then I saw myself. I was standing in front of the house, with the same family behind me. But this time, their faces were no longer empty. They were smiling. My phone vibrated again. A text message. The sender was unknown. The message was brief. "You'll return. We're always waiting." My heart pounded so hard I couldn't hear anything else. I knew this wasn't the end. The house hadn't let me go. It was in every photograph, every shadow, and every thought. It was inside me. The next morning, I sat in the corner of the motel room, hunched over, barely moving. My thoughts were scattered, like the fragments of a shattered mirror. The photographs from the camera lay on the table, their faces seeming to follow my every move. But the worst part was that in every shadow, I saw the house, as if it had become a part of me. At 10 a.m. Dan arrived. He stepped into the room, bringing with him an aura of normalcy that felt alien and unwelcome. Everything that had happened made me feel like an outsider in the real world. I tried to explain it all, to show him the photographs, but he only sighed. "Jason, you look awful. Are you sure you're not losing it?" he said, flipping through the pictures. "These aren't hallucinations, Dan," I snapped, nearly shouting. "The house is alive. It's pulling me back. I can't escape it." "Fine," he said, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "We'll go back there together and figure this out. Maybe there's something you missed." His words cut through me like a cold blade. Go back to the house? I didn't want to. But deep down, I knew I couldn't leave this story unfinished. We left later that day. Dan drove, calmly listening to the radio as if this were just another errand. I stared at the road, feeling the forest grow darker with every turn. When we arrived, the house loomed between the trees, bigger than before, as if it had been waiting for us. "It looks like just an old house, Jason," Dan said as he got out of the car. "Are you sure this isn't just in your head? You'll understand soon enough," I muttered, trying to steady my shaking hands. We entered the house, and Dan's demeanor changed immediately. His face grew serious, his eyes lingering on every detail. In the living room, the tape recorder still sat on the mantel. I pressed play, and the voices of the family filled the air. Dan stepped back. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "It's them. They're here," I said. The voices shifted into whispers that seemed to come from every corner. We heard a child's laughter. Doors began slamming and opening on their own. Dan rushed toward the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. "They won't let us leave," I said. "We need to find something to stop them." We made our way to the basement. It felt darker and heavier than I remembered. The table still held the photographs, but now they had changed. Each one showed us, me and Dan, as though we had already become part of the story. "This is insane," Dan stammered, his voice trembling. "We have to do something." My attention was drawn to the film. I realized it was the source of everything. The film kept the house alive, preserving the images of everyone who had ever been trapped here. I lifted the film to the light. Strange symbols covered its surface, pulsating as though alive. This was the key. "We have to destroy it," I said. "Then do it," Dan replied, glancing nervously at the shadows gathering in the corners. I threw the film into the fire. Flames roared to life, and the house began to shake violently. The voices turned into screams, and the whispers grew louder and louder until they were deafening. Walls cracked, beams collapsed. We ran toward the exit, and this time the door was open. We burst out of the house just as it caved in on itself, collapsing into nothingness, as though it had been swallowed by the void. When we reached the car, I turned back. The house was gone. In its place was an empty clearing, surrounded by the silent forest. Dan said nothing, his face pale and drawn. "Was it real?" he finally asked. "More real than I ever could have imagined," I replied. We climbed into the car and drove away. But as I glanced into the rearview mirror, my heart stopped. For a brief moment, the house was there, standing in the forest, untouched and unbroken. And on its porch, I stood, holding the camera,